Alright, so let's get into the articles that we're going to read for this week. First, we're going to read something authored by Matthew Altman and Cynthia Ko. They write an article titled Punishment Theory, Mass Incarceration, and the Overdetermination of Racialized Justice. So, in this paper, they talk about two separate theories for justifying punishment, that is, retributivism and deterrence. So, retributivism as a theory is often related to a saying that many of you have probably heard. It's a very ancient saying of an eye for an eye as a theory of justice, but essentially holds that the justification for punishment is the idea that those who cause harm or violate laws deserve to be punished as retribution for this wrongdoing. So it's essentially a backward-looking kind of theory, because what justifies punishment is in the present is the details of the past. So you might also associate something like retributivism with, when we're thinking about the frameworks we've learned about in this class, with something like a sort of a deontological or rule-based sort of reasoning, because it's not about consequences, it's about previous actions. Deterrence is another theory of punishment justification, and this one is about consequences. So deterrence theory says that the justification for punishment is the idea that other people will see someone being punished for a crime, and because of the fear that they then have of incurring similar consequences, of experiencing that kind of punishment, this will, according to the theory, prevent them from also committing crimes. So these are sort of the major theories for justifying punishment as a practice. And if you take a class on legal philosophy or on political philosophy, you'll probably hear about them in much more detail. But in Altman and Ko's paper, they want to take these sort of abstract sorts of theories and try to demonstrate that they are not neutral, as they sort of claim to be, and they are not divorced from real, live, actually lived experiences of social inequality. So, in particular, they argue that, quote, although in the abstract both theories are race-neutral, they function in a concrete sense to overdetermine negative outcomes for black males especially, resulting in disproportionately high incarceration rates. So they go on to say that philosophers need to look at these theories not just in the abstract, and not just evaluate them on the conceptual level, but also see how they are used in practice, and how that comes to bear on their validity as a theory. So they say, quote, in light of their unequal application, philosophers should evaluate consequentialism and retributivism not only as theoretical abstractions, but should take into account the socio-political system, its goals, and its conceptions of desert and responsibility that they are used to support. So first, so that's sort of the crux of what's going on here. They're asking us to take a look at these common theories of justifying punishment and actually see how they are deployed, particularly as they relate to mass incarceration, and even more specifically as they relate to discrepancies in racial outcomes in terms of incarceration. So they begin their article by offering some very important statistics about mass incarceration in the United States, and also discussing the causes of mass incarceration in the U.S. So I ask you to take a look at the specifics that they go over here. But they argue that, mass incarceration is a very complex phenomenon, but the sort of driving force is, because they note a big increase in the number of incarcerated people in the United States since the 1970s, the percentage increase has really sort of shot through the roof. And they say that, it's a complex phenomenon, but that the driving force behind mass incarceration has really been the stricter implementation of laws that already exist, and the introduction of new sorts of laws. So new behaviors are being criminalized. So they then discuss how incarceration is justified in the U.S. through seemingly contradictory theories of retributivism and deterrence, and really focus on serious racial disparities that we see related to incarceration. So they have a whole section on this. These are very important sections. They include a lot of data. They're worth spending some time with. And this is the part of the essay, so if you recall from the intro video, often these applied ethics papers are going to make two families of claims. One of them is going to be establishing something that exists in the world, often, and then establishing the sort of moral reasoning that we should apply to this thing that's going on in the world. So many of the initial sections of this paper focus on sort of setting the groundwork by establishing some facts about the state of the world, particularly the state of mass incarceration in the United States, with a particular focus on how this affects black men, who are the most disproportionately incarcerated population in the United States. So this is where they set the groundwork, and then in the last few sections, they start to focus on their main sort of moral argument, and this hinges on the concept of overdetermination. So let's talk a little bit about what overdetermination is, what it means. In short, overdetermination is when a particular outcome has multiple causes that are all moving in the same direction. They're all sort of pushing this event to the same end. And that any one of these causes, there are multiple causes being brought to bear on, say, a particular person or a particular state of affairs. And maybe one of these causes alone would be sufficient to reach the outcome in question, but there's actually a number of causes all working to reach a particular outcome. So it's having this overabundance of pressure towards a particular outcome. And it's a concept that first emerges in the field of psychology. But like an example might be, what would be an overdetermined physical thing is if I walk outside of my house and I end up getting wet, and not only is it pouring rain, but actually my neighbor decided to play a prank on me. It's pouring rain, I don't have an umbrella, but my neighbor also came over to play a prank on me and dumped a bucket of water on my head. So now I am soaked, both because of the rain and because of the choice of my neighbor. So the outcome of me being soaking wet is overdetermined in the sense that we have multiple forces working to make this outcome a fact. Okay, so the specific concept of overdetermination that they use in this article comes from a person named Frantz Fanon. And Fanon is a very important Afro-Caribbean and French political thinker, political philosopher. He was also a psychiatrist. And he wrote very extensively and very influentially about the effects of colonization, particularly the effects of colonization on the people who are subject to these conditions, so on colonized populations. And in their article, they describe how Fanon himself, who was black, felt when subject to the gaze of white people who were involved in colonization. So Fanon writes that no matter who he was as an individual, no matter the specifics of his own personhood, he was always viewed by white people in this sort of colonial framework as aggressive, as irrational, and as a threat to the social order. So, to quote Fanon, he says, "I am given no chance. I am overdetermined from without. I am fixed." And that is because he was subject to numerous existing myths about race and racial meaning. And so his status as a sort of threat to the colonial social order is because of the multitude of these myths that are at work in the minds of the people who are perceiving him. His status is thus overdetermined. And as a result of this, in congruence with this, his status as an autonomous individual, as a rational individual, is severely diminished or erased in the eyes of those who see him this way. So that is sort of the concept of overdetermination that they employ here in this article. And then they have a section on how does determination function in the legal system. And so really echoing Fanon, They argue that people of color are considered responsible beings to the extent that it justifies people being punished as a means of desert, because they desert, meaning because they deserved it, which would be on the retributivist model, and that they are considered irresponsible to the extent that it justifies deterrence and incapacities or incapacitization in prison. So they're saying that on one hand, people are seen as irresponsible in a particular way, as unable to uphold certain social standards, and then in another vein, but at the same time, as sort of hyper-responsible, and that they're responsible maybe for things that don't even have to do with themselves as an individual, but with maybe broader social conditions or with sort of broader racial myths that are being applied to them. So they say that although theoretically consequentialism and retributivism are contrary to each other, one being sort of forward-looking and one being sort of backward-looking in order to justify punishment, that both of these theories have been deployed as a means to justify racialized outcomes. And that this is how overdetermination functions, is that regardless of the reasons or of the specifics of the reasons, or whether they are in contradiction or whether there's some sort of hypocrisy involved in these reasons, we arrive at the same result. And that result, in this case, is mass incarceration, particularly as it affects black men. So this just means that, again, in the style of Fanon, that the racism of society means that these racist narratives, many of them, are being applied to individuals and making it such that they are seen, whether or not they behave in criminal ways, whatever, as more worthy of punishment, outside of whether there's a backward-looking reason that we think that they should be punished according to some retributivist theory, or a forward reason that we think they should be prevented from committing crimes according to a more consequentialist style of reasoning. The authors of this paper argue that because of sort of the overdetermination of both theories in congruence with these sort of racialized myths, that as a group, people are going to be seen as just more worthy of punishment. So what do they see then as the task of philosophers? Because they have a very specific prescription for how they think what role they think philosophers should play in addressing mass incarceration. And essentially, they see it as the task of philosophers to see the real-world application of the theories that we talk about, to see how these theories are being used and the effects that they have as important as bearing on the validity of the theories themselves. So I'm going to read a quote from them. They say, "If we recognize that the concepts of desert, blame, and dangerousness serve racially charged social functions, this brings into focus assumptions that have remained unacknowledged in our theories of punishment. Philosophers have an obligation to analyze and evaluate the theories not in the abstract, but in the racialized context in which they have been applied." So that is sort of the crux of this article, or sort of the end at which they're aiming here. And I think, it's a pretty dense article. Much of it is written in the style of what might be referred to as critical theory, or more continental branches of philosophy, which often include references to certain psychoanalytic theories. So I encourage you to be patient as you read it, take your time with it, and just take some time to sort of let it sink in or think about it before reacting immediately. But I think what they do really nicely here is they exemplify a sort of classic style of an applied ethics type argument, in that they really offer a lot of data and offer a sort of background about the phenomenon that they're addressing. And then they say that they sort of bring the theory down to earth. And a lot of applied ethics is sort of like, so to speak, where the rubber meets the road, in that we're taking these wonderful in our minds, these great abstract theories, and we're saying, okay, but what do we do about this particular issue in the world? And how can these theories apply to this particular issue? So I think they raise some really important questions about what the function of philosophers is, and how maybe abstracted or seemingly neutral concepts are used. Charles Mills, who they talk about in this article, is another philosopher who did a lot of this in criticizing philosophers like Kant and Locke and other very famous philosophers in the Western canon for sort of what they leave out of their philosophy and how their philosophies really take shape in the real world. So this is a very, very different article. The style employed here is very different than the one employed in the next article we're going to read. So I encourage you to really pay attention to those differences moving forward.